people who work at cemeteries and graveyards, what scary stuff have you witnessed? Hi everyone. Fair warning, today's video is pretty long, so buckle up and prepare for some spooky stories that honestly got me a little freaked out while recording this. Story 1. My mom and stepdad were the caretakers of a small cemetery for about 10 years. All of us kids, 6 between the two of them, helped out at one point or another. One summer, I was helping my mom with mowing and upkeep. It was a super hot summer, so we would try to go and get the mowing done early before the heat became too unbearable. Well, we had trouble getting the truck going one day, so we ended up starting a little later than usual, and were unable to finish up everything that day. My mom had an appointment the next morning, and the day after that it was supposed to rain. So I told her I would go up early the next morning and finish up the trimming with the weed eater. So it's about 7 in the morning, and I am listening to music with my headphones and going around the headstones. Everything was going well until I got to the oldest section of the cemetery. That part was on a small slope of a hill. Once you got to the bottom and looked up, you couldn't see the road, but you could see it again once you were about halfway up. When I finished up the last headstone, I turned off my equipment and started back up the hill. I glanced up in time to see a little girl in a pretty red dress. She was running and disappeared behind a large headstone. I figured her parents were visiting another grave and the little girl ran off to entertain herself. It was around 9 a.m. At this point, I got to the top of the hill and there were no cars or people around. The cemetery wasn't really close to any houses, and the girl was too nicely dressed to have walked out there. I looked around and shouted for her to come out again. I couldn't find her anywhere. I called my mom and told her what was going on, and asked if I should call the police and tell them about this little girl. She looked to be about 3 or 4 years old, so she certainly shouldn't be by herself. My mom asked me if she was wearing a red dress. I said, yes, why? So she proceeds to nonchalantly tell me that it was just the ghost girl. Now, everyone who knows me knows that I don't mess with ghosts. I asked why she didn't tell me there was a ghost in the cemetery. She said she needed my help and was afraid I wouldn't go up if I thought it was haunted. Now, granted, I probably would have been leerier of the place, but knowing no one else could help her, I would have still helped her that summer. But I would have made sure I wasn't there by myself. I still go there sometimes as I have relatives buried there, but I am always with someone. Fortunately, I never saw any other ghosts, and I have never seen the little ghost girl ever again. Look, for cemetery ghosts, I feel like a nice little girl is probably the luckiest you could get when it comes to threat level. It was kind of crappy for your mom not to tell you though, especially since you have a known phobia of them. I know that if my mom did that to me, I would have just noped out of there faster than the little girl disappeared. Story 2. I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia, a summertime job for a 16-year-old. Nothing crazy, just cleaning off the grime of the elements on tombstones, etc. Now, to just put a setting, the cemetery included one building that housed bathrooms for the 5 staff members of the cemetery, a small, simple mausoleum, and then, other than that, flat earth with tombstones everywhere. The only surroundings were dense forest in the Georgia country. That being said, due to the eerie surroundings, I was always a bit paranoid. Plus, I watch a lot of scary movies and so on. I know, bad combo. So one night, I was doing my rounds and I had to go into the small mausoleum. Had some of the richer families in the areas entombed within, and I had to go in, make sure all was neat and clean. Standards had to be upheld for these uppity folks. So I approached, and right off the bat, something was off. The air was pretty damn cold during the summer in Georgia. That was odd. There was a light coming from the mausoleum. And as I approached, I heard voices. Laughter? Laughter from a child, a little girl. I thought it was simply younger folks, maybe. I haven't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, and the laughter sounded young. However, as I got closer, the voices and laughter died, like almost instantly. I paused. The light I also noticed had gone out, so I called the lone security officer that does a few rounds on the lot. Because I'm not going to go in alone, and he comes. We will call him Officer Friendly. When Officer Friendly arrives, we both go inside. We see one of the doors to the entombed remains of a young girl open. Nothing was disturbed within, but it was open, and a doll lay on the stone beneath it. Me and Officer Friendly do a small sweep. It was only 1 floor in 1 room, so it didn't take long. We close the door to the girl's entombment, and we both leave. As we walk away, we get about 30 feet from the mausoleum, and then all of a sudden, boom, voices and laughter again. I jump, and an Officer Friendly looking at me looking pretty shaken, says to me, "You hear it too?" We look back and boom, lights back, laughter continuing. We don't go back and just book it. I found out the next morning the door was open again. This time, the doll was on the other side of the mausoleum from where we found it the night before. I resigned the next day. I'm good, lol. I like how Opie made it sound super casual that he was a tombstone caretaker as a 16-year-old. Like it was the most regular summer job ever. I think at that age, I worked at a retail store in a theme park, which honestly might be just as terrifying as his job. Can't blame him though for quitting the day after. I would too if I saw a creepy doll keep moving. Story 3. I spend lots of time in a local cemetery. The weirdest thing there to me is the small section located a little bit off to the side that's filled with many very old graves marked only by numbers. I'm not sure how many there are exactly, but I've seen the numbers go up past 300 if I remember correctly. Some of them have little flags by them indicating that they're a veteran. However, no names or dates accompany the number. I never really figured out why. They were just numbered and had no identity. In the same area, there's a grave that has no number, but does have a name, dates of birth and death, and birthplace. But it's entirely in Greek. Reading it reveals that they were born in Lakaria, Greece, and they share a last name and birthplace with another entirely Greek grave located all the way across the cemetery. Not necessarily creepy, but I thought it was interesting. I wonder why they weren't buried closer together, if they're related. There was also a grave in one of the newer sections that had a note posted next to it from the wife of the man buried there, angry that some lowlife had stolen the flowers she had left by his grave. Seeing this made me angry as well. So I picked some flowers from my yard and left them there with my own note, explaining that the idea of stealing flowers from a grave broke my heart, and I'm sorry someone would do such a thing. I wonder if she ever saw it. I hope it wasn't out of line for me to do that. Also, I have seen things and felt things in my presence while I walked alone between graves. Nothing too serious, just movement out of the corner of my eyes, and feeling like I'm not alone, when truly I'm the only one around that area. I'm not entirely sure if I believe in ghosts or not, but if they are ghosts, I hope they don't mind me hanging around so often. I really enjoy the peace and quiet of the cemetery, as well as the beautiful monuments and interesting history you can find there. Sorry that this comment was so long and the stories may not be quite as strange or scary as others may have, but I wanted to chime in because I have a passion for cemeteries in general. While this story wasn't as scary as the others, it was very heartwarming to read, which I think we all could use. Big props to OP for taking some time to pick flowers from their own yard to put on the random person's grave. Whoever robbed the grave, though, is probably one of the biggest jerks I've read about so far. Story 4. My boyfriend is a gravedigger and caretaker of an old cemetery right by us. Besides seeing the typical disappearing person here and there, he doesn't really have stories. However, I think the way he got that job is amazing. Before working at the cemetery, my boyfriend quit his farming job of nearly 25 years. That left him unemployed for a few months and kind of lost as a person who likes to have goals and such. Anyway, one night I decided we should go to that cemetery with a recorder and ask if there is life after death. The aim was to get a recording of a voice or a sign in some way. Boyfriend seemed pretty cool with it, until about 5 minutes after we started walking through the cemetery. First thing I noticed was my boyfriend had taken his hat off and was holding it over his heart with a worried look on his face, while I was holding the recorder and giving our initial greetings to any potential spirits listening. I said to the spirits, I hope we're not being disrespectful by being here. We don't mean any harm. I only have one question and then we'll leave. I then ask, while my boyfriend is silent the entire time, if there is life after death. Because I didn't hear anything, I pushed it a bit, asking repeatedly. I just decided to ask for a sign, blinking lights, when my boyfriend finally spoke, saying, I think we should have respect and leave now. His eyes were watery. I could tell he was having strong feelings about it, so we left. I did review the video later that night and discovered that although I couldn't see lights blinking while we were there, on the video they twinkled like stars. And that was that. Until 2 days later, my boyfriend gets a call. He knows everybody, offering him a job at the cemetery. After our initial surprise, I said, you'd honestly be a perfect person to work there. You clearly have respect for the dead. It's been about 4 years now. My boyfriend is the guy who stands with respect throughout a burial gathering with the family and waits until he thinks everyone is truly ready for the lowering of the casket. Story 5. I grew up next to one my entire life. My grandfather and uncles have mowed it and have been on the board of trustees that manage the place my whole life. The most unexplainable thing happened before I was old enough to mow there, age 9 or so. I remember one winter, it was snowy and very cold. But for 3 days, a casket was left sitting next to a gravestone for the space of like 3 days or something, and finally got lowered into the ground after that. Not sure if it was because the cold or snow made it impossible to dig. Dirt might have collapsed from the side after the hole was dug and had to wait for the weather to break. Not sure, but I 100% remember the casket on the hillside for a couple days. The second most unexplainable thing, and the freakiest, is the storage shed on the edge of the cemetery. There's windows on the side to look in, mostly ladders, folding chairs, landscaping equipment. However, in the rafters, every year there are dead snakes hanging from them. I cannot for the life of me figure out how they get up there, let alone how they stay in there and die. I can see how they get inside from the wooden door gaps, but not up in the rafters on top. My uncle never goes in the shed for that reason. It stays locked and never gets used. I found a Boys Life Boy Scout magazine from the 70s that disintegrated as I picked it up laying there. So it definitely never gets used aside from the time they let me look inside it. I also wonder how the snake's bones and skin don't stay up in the rafters, because no one goes in there to clean them out. I imagine mice, rats, or something eat the remains. Story 6. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in the reception and office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance, which was locked and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines, begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of New Jersey, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate, and no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance, and you could see us, the office manager and me, talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day, we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside that gate. There were multiple cameras, and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate. And you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. I've heard of the Day of the Dead where spirits are allowed to roam the earth for the night, but I've never heard of them being able to do it for the Sabbath. I just hope the lady was able to get back to her grade and isn't stuck roaming around and waiting. Story 7. I worked all last summer for a small town. Part of my job was going out and weed whacking and mowing the cemetery once a week, meaning I spent 8 to 16 hours a week out there depending on what needed to be done. There was a man out there who would show up right beside the same grave every time I was on the lawnmower. Every day without fail, his shadow would appear in the middle of the field besides the same grave in the middle of a treeless section of the cemetery. I think he was just a lonely spirit on the way to the next life. After I quit, I was packing up to move back to college, and I was standing in the middle of a bedroom in the basement holding an Actifry. The thing turns on and beeps and runs for about 30 seconds. And I'm holding the cord and standing in the middle of the room. I think he realized I wasn't coming back and decided to mess with me a bit, honestly. A lot of the old guys from town were known to be pranksters. The only other thing I can think of is the squirrel carcasses that would appear. I think it might have been a hawk, but every few days without fail, there would be about 4 to 5 new rodent carcasses, funny skin like a hunter had skinned them, under an old dead tree. That thought freaked me out the most. Story 8. I live in a large European city, and there's a graveyard close to where I live that is a few hundred years old. A few famous people from the past are buried there. However, there is a grave with a big crypt on it. This crypt has no name, and it isn't like your typical crypt. It is made up of a statue in front of a curved wall that arches over the statue a bit. The statue itself depicts a Virgin Mary-like woman who holds a human heart in her hand, like you would a cross while praying. The whole crypt is made of a beautiful white marble, and it has these chaotic pitch black lines running across it. The wall behind the statue makes me shiver in a fascinating, eerie way. The wall is covered with fine gold inlays that depict an all-seeing eye, within a pyramid that is held by a hand reaching from a golden cloud above. The all-seeing eye is emitting golden rays falling upon a valley, in which a small version of our planet is sitting just above a river, with mountains on each side. If we then look at the statue in front of it again, we will notice that there is a cylindrical hole going through the heart, in which a triangle is set, with a golden, all-seeing eye engraved on all sides. Dan Brown would have a good time trying to decipher this one. Story 9. Somewhat related. I didn't work in a graveyard or cemetery, but I ran marketing and business development for a manufacturer in high-end electronics in the luxury market. In servicing this high-end market, we had customer support that matches the expectations that buyers, or more importantly, these systems integrators, expect. We had a particular end-user customer that had been having some failures of our equipment, and things just stopped working. While equipment failures are not uncommon, having several failures is not the norm, as the failure rates are usually around 2 to 3% across the industry. One day, one of our sales reps was doing a visit to all the resellers and integrators in the area and visited the house, or rather mansion, to do a quick inspection. Part of the reason was that the integrator wanted us to look at the setup, and the other reason was to implicitly imply that something was wrong with our equipment, assuming the install and configuration was done correctly by the integrator. Our sales rep goes to the home and learns that it is not just our equipment that was failing, but that other electronics in the home had issues as well. She found out that the home had significant electrical surges. And she also learned that the home was built on top of an old Indian burial ground. We stopped being so generous with warranty claims for this customer after that. Story 10. I don't work in either, but this story is about a court case that was featured on one of those small claim shows, I think. A few small details I don't remember exactly, but this sticks in my mind. Basically, this woman had her mother buried and was deep in grief. Then the area where she was buried got flooded and her mother's casket came up out of the ground. If I remember, the funeral people were claiming an act of God, but don't quote me on that. The daughter was horrified to find out what happened, as anyone would be, but understandably was almost in hysterics because her mother feared drowning, and the cause of her mother's death was water in the lungs. The other news story I read was about a family who found out the ashes they were given were only cement, and there was this huge investigation launched. But it was such a hard thing to piece together because they couldn't tell what belongs to who. Turns out that there had been other complaints, including one family who had remains, including remnants of a watch and jewelry. The deceased had none on. The worst part of the whole thing, the funeral director had a connected business that donates body parts. It was in Colorado if you want to Google it. Both of these stories are so creepy to me. I can't imagine essentially going through your greatest fear after you've died. Add on top of that the fact that your loved one's body parts were being switched around for someone else's profit. Absolutely terrifying. If I was that family, I would try to sue with every single thing I could. Story 11. Not really a cemetery experience, but it was still pretty freaky. My grandparents live out in the middle of nowhere, pretty much, and are surrounded by woods. On their property, there was a whole family that owned my grandfather's property before them. From what I was told, they were killed or something like that. A few years ago, when I was still living with my grandparents, a relative that was related to the dead family came up to the property and wanted to remove the bodies from the land. My grandpa was extremely happy about it because he wanted to expand the house, but couldn't because he didn't want to mess with the graves. So they got together and I stood nearby, watching them dig up 4 caskets. There were 3 adult-sized caskets and 1 child-sized casket, and they all looked really old. One of the bigger caskets had holes and cracks all over it. That was the one that my grandpa and the other relative was carrying when the body fell out at the bottom of the casket. The body was pretty much bones, but it still had old muscle and tissue on it. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as I watched them uncomfortably put the body back into the casket upside down. Story 12. I worked for a county cemetery department years ago. We would go to all the cemeteries in the county and mow or just do basic upkeep. Occasionally people, mainly farmers, would stumble upon some headstones in a field or a stand of trees, and we would come out and prod the ground with dowel rods to find more headstones and reestablish the cemetery. Soon after I started working there, we got a tip about some headstones a farmer found while clearing out a path through some trees for easier access to his fields. It turned out to be the oldest cemetery in the county, dating back to the 1700s. After investigating some of the names on the headstones, it got really creepy. The story is that before the cemetery, there was a schoolhouse. The teachers were a husband and wife. It's not clear what exactly happened, but the students and the husband and wife all died in the schoolhouse. The information we found kind of made it sound like an illness of some kind, and they were all quarantined in the school until they all died. After that, the school was demolished and the students and husband and wife were all buried right where the school stood. So yeah, I'm sure it's haunted. Story 13. My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. Aside from the occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out not to be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually a quite peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins, or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire fam would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in and close her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs and pictures and crap. It's freaking creepy opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of the people inside. Plus, when you hop down in there, you have a weird realization that you're at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. Story 14. I take care of a small family mausoleum. The family that is buried there has no living descendants, so it falls on me to clean out the facility and replace the flowers inside the building. I also make sure that there's no damage to the mausoleum. I've become very acquainted with the family that is buried inside. One day as I was closing at my office, my phone rang, and when I answered it, there was a very agitated woman on the other end. She was very clearly under the influence of something. She asked me repeatedly if I knew where Jane Smith was. Jane Smith has been buried in the mausoleum since the early 1900s. I asked her why she needed to know. The woman very calmly asked me to go to the mausoleum and to double check that Jane was still there, because she believed that she was her. I assured her that I was pretty sure Jane was still peacefully buried, and our phone conversation ended a few moments later. Drugs and alcohol are a hell of a thing, but it still creeped me out enough that I don't answer my phone after 5 p.m. any longer, and I make sure someone is with me when I go to the cemetery. That sounds absolutely petrifying to get a call that someone believes that they are specifically a dead person. I'm not sure if I agree that the person was drugged out. It could be someone who strongly believes in reincarnation. But hey, you never know. Don't blame OP, though, for not wanting to go back to that mausoleum alone. Story 15. Former funeral director here. My partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to the embalming table, we heard an audible click and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other. He was an extremely religious man, and this event visibly shook him, and he left not long after the incident. I shut the radio off as I typically use my phone to listen to music while embalming. When I'd finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table, I heard that click from that old radio, and it turned on full volume yet again. At that point, I was fairly freaked out and made my exit not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge, before or after. Story 16. I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. The 12th century, as in the church and its surrounding graveyard, had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in this small patch of ground for many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shells, except on closer examination. All the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there. Story 17. I used to work as a park ranger in a cemetery in London, which has been converted into a nature reserve. It's a very ghetto area, and the local kids nicknamed it the Forest. Regularly, we'd find ammunition, knives, and occasionally pistols hidden in the memorials or gravestones, and the police would be called to collect them. A friend once found a backpack full of Molotov cocktails prepared. I never saw a pistol myself. Only once I had the honor of finding something. I found a plastic bag stuffed behind a collapsed monument, and inside it had a load of shotgun shells. It was terrifying for me, because you have no idea if someone is watching you or aware that you've just found their stash. The police come, you have to show them where it was, and that further highlights your involvement to any of the local kids watching you. That particular park people avoid as soon as the sun goes down. Story 18. I used to work as a receptionist in a funeral home. One busy Saturday, everyone left to go to the cemetery with the family for the graveside service, except for the one embalmer who was downstairs working. I was doing paperwork when my phone rang, and it was someone calling the internal line from the prep room, where the embalmer was. I answered, and I could hear the radio clearly playing in the background, but nobody was on the line. I walked 10 feet into the office beside me, and the embalmer was sitting at the computer working on something. I asked her who was downstairs in the prep room, and she looked at me funny and said, "There's nobody down there. They all went to the cemetery." She was right. There was no one else in the building. I don't believe in spirits or anything of the sort, but that certainly creeped me out. Yeah, no, that's definitely creepy. Maybe whoever was down there got a little lonely or just wanted to share their favorite song with OP. I have a lot of respect for anyone who works in a funeral home, but I know I'm way too much of a scaredy cat to do that. Story 19. My dad was a cemetery superintendent, so we were in residence there from the time I started high school. I lived there with my parents for about 5 years. My dad worked in the same cemetery and lived there for 35 years. There's nothing strange or scary in a cemetery. They can actually be very peaceful, idyllic places. Anything that would be strange or scary is brought there by your own preconceptions and expectations. You can stretch the symbols of old worn tombstones, the shapes of trees in the seasons, the mist and fog of weather, to scare yourself. It was a human, very much alive agency that was scary. It was 160 acres in the middle of the city. Tons of kids roamed that place at night. They drank and freaked all over the place. They also committed acts of vandalism. One night, a group went through and knocked over 160 plus tombstones. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.